My husband spent years grooming me to be the perfect fall guy for a massive criminal scheme, only to realize too late that he had accidentally handed me the power to dismantle his entire world. I was supposed to be the silent victim, but when the authorities came knocking, I chose to burn his empire to the ground instead. The champagne was still chilling in the fridge, a vintage bottle I'd spent 2 months' salary on, meant to celebrate Mark's appointment to senior vice president. For years, I had been the steady anchor while he chased his ambitions. I'd moved cities, sacrificed my own career trajectory, and played the perfect hostess to his insufferable colleagues. When he finally got the news, he didn't kiss me. He didn't toast to our future. He walked into our bedroom, tossed his briefcase onto the duvet, and told me he was filing for divorce because I no longer fit the aesthetic of the life he was about to lead. The irony was suffocating. I stood there in the kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of the life we had built, listening to him talk about personal growth and diverging paths. He sounded like a corporate manifesto, cold and calculated. He wasn't just leaving me, he was scrubbing me out of his timeline like a typo in a quarterly report. I was expected to vacate the house within the week, accept a pathetic alimony settlement, and vanish into the background of his glorious upward trajectory. He had the paperwork ready, signed by a firm that clearly prioritized speed over morality. But as I sat at the kitchen island, staring at the divorce papers, the front door chime rang, a sound that usually signaled a grocery delivery or a neighbor. Instead, when I opened the door, 2 men in sharp charcoal suits stood on my porch. They didn't identify themselves as police, but they had that unmistakable, terrifying aura of authority. They didn't want me. They wanted Mark. When I told them he was in his study, they bypassed me with a chilling efficiency, their footsteps echoing through our pristine foyer. I followed them, paralyzed by a sudden, sinking dread. I reached the study door just in time to hear the sound of a struggle and the metallic click of restraints. Mark was shouting, his voice shrill and devoid of the corporate confidence he displayed an hour earlier. He was being accused of something far worse than infidelity or professional malpractice. The men were talking about a hidden ledger, a massive financial discrepancy that connected him directly to an organized scheme that had been bleeding the company dry for 3 years. They began emptying his desk, pulling out files that had nothing to do with legitimate business. One of the agents held up a secure, encrypted device, the kind you only see in spy thrillers, and then reached into the back of his desk drawer, pulling out a heavy black object wrapped in a velvet cloth. Even from the doorway, I recognized the silhouette of an illegal weapon. My stomach turned. My husband, the man who complained about his neighbors not mowing their lawns and obsessed over his credit score, was now facing a charge that could land him in prison for decades. One of the agents turned to me, his expression unreadable. He held out a tablet, his finger hovering over a signature line. "Ma'am," he said, his voice flat, "we have reason to believe your husband has been using your private accounts to launder funds. We need to confirm if you were a co-signatory on these specific transactions, or if you were simply another victim in this web of deception." My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at the documents on the screen. The dates, the signatures, they were all mine. I had signed them thinking they were mundane investment disclosures. I had trusted him with everything. I realized then that my husband hadn't been climbing the corporate ladder. He had been building a bunker, and he had used my identity as the foundation. "I didn't know," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Ignorance is a defense we'll have to discuss at the station," the agent replied, motioning toward the door. Mark looked at me then, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic fear. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't apologize for the divorce or the life he'd ruined. Instead, he leaned in, his voice a frantic hiss as the officers tightened their grip on his arms. "Whatever you do," he whispered, his face inches from mine, "do not mention the basement safe. If you tell them what's inside that vault, they won't just give me an enormous term behind bars. They'll come for you too." The floor seemed to drop out from beneath me. The basement safe was the one place in the house I had never been allowed to touch, a room he claimed held sensitive corporate archives. As the agents dragged him out of the study and toward the waiting black car, I stood frozen in the hallway. I heard the front door slam shut, the sound of the engine turning over, and then a silence so heavy it felt like it might crush my lungs. I looked at the hallway closet, the door to the basement hidden behind a mahogany panel. I knew that if I opened it, I would either find the proof of my innocence or the evidence that I was just as guilty as the man who had just destroyed my life. I took a shaky step toward the door, my hand reaching for the handle, when my phone vibrated violently on the floor. I picked it up, expecting a call from a lawyer, but the screen displayed a single, blocked number. I pressed speaker, my breath hitching in my throat. "We know you're still in the house," a distorted voice growled. "You have 10 minutes to open that safe and hand over the packets with the substance, or you won't live to see the dawn." The cold dread that washed over me was absolute, a paralysis that seeped into my marrow. The 10-minute window felt like a countdown clock ticking in my very veins. I dropped the phone as if it had turned into a burning coal, the screen glowing mockingly against the hardwood floor. Who were these people? My mind raced, trying to reconcile the suburban life I had curated, the garden parties, the book clubs, the quiet, predictable Tuesday nights, with the reality that my husband had been moonlighting as a high-stakes criminal. I looked toward the basement door. The silence in the house was no longer peaceful. It was predatory. Every creak of the settling floorboards sounded like a footstep. I realized with terrifying clarity that Mark hadn't been filing for divorce because he had outgrown me. He had been trying to insulate me, or perhaps he had been trying to ensure that when the roof finally caved in, I would be the one standing directly under the debris. He had tried to discard me like a damaged piece of evidence. I moved toward the kitchen, my movements frantic and jerky. I needed a weapon, anything, but all I found was the heavy, serrated chef's knife I'd used to prepare his victory dinner just hours ago. The weight of it in my hand felt wrong, a domestic tool now repurposed for survival. I crept toward the basement panel. It was a masterpiece of hidden engineering, blending perfectly into the wainscoting. I pressed the hidden spring Mark had shown me once, years ago, during a drunken tour of the house. He had laughed then, calling it his little secret room for the tax documents. The panel clicked and swung inward, revealing a set of steep, dark stairs that smelled of ozone and stagnant air. I descended, the dim, motion sensor lights flickering to life, illuminating a space that looked nothing like an office. There were no filing cabinets, no stacks of mundane corporate reports. Instead, the room was dominated by a heavy, reinforced steel safe, bolted to the concrete floor, surrounded by high-end digital equipment and banks of servers that hummed with a low, sinister drone. I approached the safe. My fingers hovered over the keypad. I didn't know the code, but I knew Mark. Everything in his life was tied to dates of significance. The day he started his firm, the day we bought the house, the date of his first promotion. I tried the obvious combinations, my breath hitching as the red light blinked a sharp, impatient rejection each time. My phone buzzed again, vibrating against the concrete floor upstairs. They were getting closer. I could hear a muffled, rhythmic thudding against the front door. They weren't knocking, they were testing the lock. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to think like Mark. He was a man of immense, fragile ego. He didn't value people, he valued achievements. I punched in the date of the merger that had put him on the map, the day he told me he was the king of the world. The mechanism groaned, the heavy locking bolts sliding back with a sound like a guillotine. The door creaked open, revealing not documents, but rows of sealed, airtight containers and several stacks of untraceable currency, thick bundles of bills that looked like they belonged in a cinematic heist. And there, in the center, was a velvet-lined box similar to the one the agents had taken from the study. I opened it. Inside lay a set of high-resolution photographs, dozens of them. As I flipped through the stack, my legs gave out. The photos weren't just of me. They were of me at the grocery store, at the gym, in the lobby of my office building. They were dated over the last 6 months. But it wasn't just surveillance. The photos showed me meeting with people I didn't recognize, people I had never spoken to. In some, I looked like I was handing over packages. In others, I looked like I was being threatened. I realized then, with a jolt of pure horror, that these were deep fakes, expertly doctored imagery designed to frame me as a central figure in his organized scheme. I wasn't just the wife who was left behind. I was the fall guy. Mark had been building a case against me for months, ensuring that if he ever went down, I would go down for everything. I was the designated scapegoat, the face they would present to the authorities to explain the missing money and the illicit dealings. Suddenly, the house above shuddered. The front door had been breached. I heard heavy boots thudding across the foyer, moving with the precision of a trained unit. They weren't the police. I could hear them calling my name, their voices calm and terrifyingly clinical. "We know you're down there, Sarah. Don't make this difficult. We just want what belongs to the group." I scrambled, grabbing a handful of documents and the memory drive attached to the server. I needed to get out, but there was only one way up, the stairs leading directly into the center of the kitchen. I crouched behind a workbench, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might bruise my ribs. I saw a shadow loom over the top of the stairs. A flashlight beam swept down, cutting through the darkness like a blade. The beam stopped on me. I held my breath, the knife gripped until my knuckles turned white. A man stepped onto the first stair, his face obscured by a black balaclava. He didn't look like a common criminal. He looked like a soldier. He pulled something from his belt, and the soft, distinct sound of a suppressed weapon sliding into position echoed through the basement. "Found her," he said into a radio, his eyes locked on mine. I looked for an alternative exit, a vent, a window, anything, but the basement was a tomb. Just as he took another step down, a massive explosion rocked the foundation of the house. The entire basement ceiling groaned and cracked, dust raining down like ash as the floorboards above collapsed in a cloud of splinters. Through the jagged hole, I saw a figure standing in the kitchen, backlit by the flickering lights of the hallway. It wasn't the man on the stairs. It was a woman, dressed in a tactical vest, her weapon leveled at the intruder. She caught my eye, her expression unreadable. "Drop the weapon!" she commanded, her voice cutting through the ringing in my ears. The man on the stairs didn't hesitate. He pivoted, aiming his weapon at her. I realized in that split second that if I didn't move, I was going to be caught in the crossfire of a war I didn't even understand. I lunged for the server rack, pulling a cord that I hoped would trigger the fire suppression system. As the room filled with thick, white chemical fog, I heard a gunshot, a deafening crack that shattered the tension. A body hit the stairs, and then the woman turned her aim toward the corner where I was hiding. She stepped into the fog, her weapon still raised, and stopped inches from my face. She reached out, not to kill me, but to grab my arm. "If you want to live," she hissed, "you'll let go of the drive and follow me right now." The chemical fog clung to my skin like wet wool, thick and suffocating. The woman's grip on my arm was ironclad, pulling me toward a corner of the basement I hadn't realized existed. Behind a stack of rotting wooden crates, she kicked aside a section of the concrete baseboard, revealing a narrow, dark crawl space that smelled of damp earth and old pipes. "Move!" she commanded, her voice devoid of warmth. I didn't think. I scrambled into the hole, the sharp edge of a concrete block tearing at my sweater. She followed me instantly, pulling a heavy steel plate back into place, just as the basement was bathed in the blinding strobe of tactical flashlights from above. We crawled through a cramped, subterranean pipe tunnel, the air growing colder and thinner with every foot of progress. My lungs burned. Every time I tried to speak, she signaled for silence, her eyes darting toward the vents that occasionally whistled with the sound of movement above us. Finally, we emerged into the hollowed-out space beneath a storm drain in a wooded area nearly a mile from the house. She stood up, checking her sidearm with practiced mechanical precision. She wasn't an officer of the law, and she certainly wasn't a friend. She was a ghost, dressed in matte black gear, no patches, no insignia. "You're not with the authorities," I rasped, my throat raw from the chemical dust. She turned, her face obscured by the twilight filtering through the trees. "The authorities are exactly why you're in this mess, Sarah. They've been looking for that server content for 3 years. Your husband wasn't just laundering money, he was a gatekeeper for a network that spans 3 continents. That drive you're clutching? That's the ledger. It has the names of the people who paid for his promotion and the names of the people who authorized the illegal weapon shipments." I looked down at the small, silver device in my hand. It seemed insignificant, a mere piece of plastic and metal, yet it held the power to topple empires and destroy me in the process. "Mark told me I was the fall guy," I whispered. "He told me he had photos, evidence that I was the one running it all." The woman let out a short, hollow laugh. He wasn't lying about the photos, but he was lying about the intent. He didn't make those for the police. He made them as insurance for the network. If he ever got caught, he planned to hand those over to the group's leaders, claiming he was being blackmailed by his own wife. He was going to sell you out to save his own neck, and he was going to make sure the network cleaned up the loose end. You. I felt the blood drain from my face. My entire life had been a script written by a man who saw me as nothing more than a convenient accessory to his own survival. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. She stepped closer, the moonlight hitting her face. She looked remarkably like someone I had seen in a peripheral memory, a woman who used to attend the same charity galas Mark dragged me to. "I'm the person he tried to replace," she said coldly. "He took my position in the organization when he realized I was getting close to the truth. Now, we're going to make sure that drive gets into the right hands before the group realizes he's in custody and sends a cleanup crew to find you." As she spoke, a low, rhythmic thrumming sound began to vibrate through the ground. It was the sound of a drone, low altitude, surveillance grade. She shoved me behind the cover of a thick oak tree, her gaze scanning the sky. The drone hovered above the tree line, its red sensor eye blinking in the dark, searching for a heat signature. "They've tracked the server's GPS signal," she whispered, her hand hovering over her holster. "We have to ditch the drive or dump the tracker. If we stay here, we're targets." "What if I give it to you?" I asked, desperation clawing at my throat. "What if I just hand it over and walk away?" "You can't walk away, Sarah. You're already listed as the primary asset in the network's internal files. The moment they confirm you're alive, you're a priority kill." She paused, her expression shifting into something almost like pity. "But there is one way out. We have to go back to the city. We have to meet the person who actually runs this network. He's the only one who can wipe your name from the system, but the price is absolute loyalty." Suddenly, the woods erupted in light. A spotlight blinded us, and the roar of a heavy engine tore through the silence. A black SUV barreled off the road, crashing through the brush and skidding to a halt 20 yards away. 4 men in tactical gear poured out, weapons raised. They weren't moving like police, they moved like hunters. The woman grabbed my wrist, pulling me toward a steep ravine. "Run!" she shouted, but as I turned to follow, a laser sight dotted my chest. A voice boomed from the SUV, amplified by a loudspeaker, echoing off the trees. "Drop the drive, Sarah. We don't want to hurt the wife of our most valuable partner. Just step into the light, and we'll ensure your husband's departure is painless." I looked at the woman, then at the drive in my hand. I realized I was trapped between two sides of the same coin. I held the drive up, the metal glinting in the harsh spotlight, and felt a surge of cold, unfamiliar fury. I didn't step forward. Instead, I turned toward the ravine and jumped. As I plummeted into the darkness, I heard the sound of gunfire raining down on the spot where I had been standing, followed by a sickening thud as the woman was struck, her body crumpling to the forest floor. I landed hard on a pile of debris at the bottom, the breath knocked out of me. As I scrambled to stand, clutching the drive, I heard the crunch of footsteps coming down the slope. They were coming to finish it. But just as the beam of a flashlight hit my face, a hand reached out from the shadows of the ravine and dragged me into a hidden cavern. The person who grabbed me wore a ring, the same distinct gold signet ring I had seen on the finger of the man who chaired Mark's company board. He pressed a finger to his lips, his eyes cold and knowing. "You're not going to hand that over to anyone," he whispered, "because you're going to use it to kill the man who ruined your life." The cavern was humid, smelling of stagnant water and cold stone, but it was the safest place I had been in for 24 hours. The man who had pulled me into the shadows was the board chairman, Marcus Vane. He looked nothing like the polished, grandfatherly figure who had toasted my husband at corporate retreats. Here, in the dim light of the cave, he looked like a predator who had spent his entire life hunting. He released my arm, his signet ring catching the faint light, a symbol of authority that suddenly felt like a brand of corruption. "You're playing a very dangerous game, Sarah," he said, his voice a smooth, low rasp. "You have the ledger, but you have no idea how to read the language of the group. If you walk out of here, they will hunt you until your lungs give out. But if you work with me, we can purge this entire mess. We can delete your existence from their servers, and you can start over. Somewhere where they'll never find you. I looked at the server drive, then back at Vane. He was one of the men at the very top of the hierarchy that Mark had served. "Why help me?" I asked, my voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. "Mark was your star player. You were promoting him." Vane chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. Mark was a liability. He grew arrogant. He thought he could steal from the network and hide it behind his wife's name. He broke the first rule. He left a trail. I don't care about the money, Sarah. I care about the silence. And currently, you are the only variable that makes enough noise to wake the authorities. He held out his hand. "Give me the drive. I'll make the accusations against you disappear, and I'll ensure your husband spends the rest of his natural life in a cell, isolated from everything he tried to protect." The offer was tempting. It sounded like a lifeline. But something in the way he looked at the drive, with a hunger that wasn't about clearing names, made my skin crawl. This wasn't about helping me. It was about reclaiming the evidence of his own involvement. I took a half step back, my fingers tightening around the cold plastic of the device. "You said you could wipe my name from the system," I said, testing him. "If I give you this, how do I know you won't just hand me over to your cleanup crew the moment the connection is secure?" Vane sighed, pulling a sleek satellite phone from his jacket. "You have to trust me, Sarah, because right now, the people in the woods above are closing in. They aren't looking for a negotiation. They are looking for a body." At that exact moment, a muffled explosion echoed from the surface, the sound of the SUV's engine being disabled or a tactical charge being set. The ground trembled, and rocks tumbled from the ceiling of the cavern. We were being found. Vane's mask of calm cracked, his eyes darting toward the cavern entrance. He didn't want to help me. He wanted the drive before his own people arrived to deal with the problem. I saw my chance. I lunged, not toward the entrance, but toward a narrow fissure in the back of the cave that I had spotted in the darkness. As I scrambled over the jagged rock, I felt a sharp tug on my coat. Vane had reached out, his face twisted in a snarl. "You foolish girl!" he roared. "You think you can run from this? You are a pawn in a game you don't even understand." He swung a heavy, ornate cane at my legs, tripping me. I slammed into the rock wall, the breath leaving me in a sharp gasp. The drive skittered across the floor, sliding toward the edge of a deep, flooded crevice. Vane lunged for it, but he was older than he looked, and he slipped on the wet stone. As he reached out to steady himself, I grabbed a heavy rock from the floor and threw it with everything I had left. It connected with his shoulder, sending him stumbling back. I scrambled for the drive, my fingers brushing against it just as the entrance to the cave was breached. Beams of tactical lights flooded the space, blinding me. A voice boomed, the same voice from the SUV, cold and clinical. "Chairman Vane, we see you. Step away from the girl." Vane stood up, dusting off his expensive suit, his composure returning as if by magic. He looked at the armed men entering the cave, then back at me with a look of absolute, chilling betrayal. "I tried to talk her down," Vane said to the men, his voice smooth and authoritative. "But she's gone completely rogue. She has the ledger, and she's already attempted to strike me. Take her. She's no longer protected by any corporate policy. Dispose of the asset." The lead operative stepped forward, his weapon leveled at my chest. I looked at the dark, flooded crevice behind me, then at the man holding the gun. My life, my marriage, my safety. It was all a lie, a carefully constructed illusion designed to end exactly like this. I looked up at the operative and did the one thing they weren't expecting. I turned and jumped backward into the black, freezing water of the crevice. As I hit the surface, the last thing I heard was the sound of rapid, suppressed gunfire splintering the stone where I had been standing a second before. I sank deep into the ice-cold dark, the drive clutched to my chest, realizing that the water wasn't just a crevice, it was an underwater tunnel, and the current was pulling me toward an exit I couldn't see. I held my breath, swimming through the black, until my lungs began to scream. Just as I thought I would pass out, I felt my hand brush against something metallic. A ladder. I grabbed it, pulling myself upward, gasping for air as I broke the surface into a small, enclosed room. I wasn't in the woods anymore. I was inside a building. I dragged myself onto the floor, shivering, and looked around. The walls were lined with monitors, hundreds of them, and on every single screen was a live feed of my own house, my office, and even the interrogation room where Mark was being held. A voice crackled over an intercom, smooth and familiar. "Well done, Sarah. I've been waiting for you to find your way to the control room." I froze. The voice belonged to the one person I had been told was dead, the person whose life I had allegedly stolen 3 years ago. The door behind me clicked open, and a figure stepped out of the shadows, holding a suppressed pistol. It was the woman from the woods, the one I thought had been killed, her tactical gear stained with blood, but her aim steady. "Now," she said, nodding at the monitors. "Let's start the broadcast." The woman, whose name I soon learned was Elena, didn't look like a ghost anymore. She looked like a general preparing for the final phase of a siege. She shoved a headset toward me, her eyes locked on the banks of monitors. "You're going to read the script, Sarah. You're going to tell the world exactly what happened, and then you're going to press the upload key that sends the ledger to every major news outlet and federal agency simultaneously. If you do this, you live. If you hesitate, we burn the whole system down with you inside it." I looked at the screens. On one, Mark was sitting in a holding cell, staring blankly at a wall, his arrogance replaced by a hollow, vacant look of defeat. On another, Vane was walking toward his private jet, still under the illusion that he had won. They were so busy protecting their reputations and their power that they hadn't realized the foundation they were standing on had already been dynamited. "Why?" I asked, my voice trembling as I reached for the headset. "Why go through all this to involve me?" "Because you were the only one they didn't see coming," Elena replied, her voice sharpening. "Vane had everyone else on his payroll. He had his own security detail, his own lawyers, his own puppets in the police force. But he couldn't control you because he didn't realize you were actually paying attention to the details he thought were boring. You were the anomaly in their data, and now you're the one who pulls the plug." I sat in the chair, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I thought about the life I had lost, the house, the fake friends, the man I had loved who saw me as nothing more than an accessory to his crimes. I realized then that I wasn't just clearing my name, I was purging my past. I hit the first key, and my voice, broadcasted live through the encrypted channels, began to fill the room. I laid out everything: the laundering, the illegal shipments, the board's direct involvement, and the names of the people who had been pulling the strings. As I spoke, I watched the monitors. The reaction was instantaneous. In the holding cell, the camera shifted as officers rushed in, not to comfort Mark, but to place him in deeper isolation as they received orders from superiors who were suddenly in a panic. At the airport, Vane's entourage stopped dead in their tracks as their phones began to chime with notifications from the global news alerts. Vane looked at his screen, his face turning a sickly, pale gray, before he turned and bolted toward the terminal, only to be swarmed by a team of federal agents who had been waiting for the signal. It was over in minutes. The network, which had seemed invincible, dissolved like smoke in a gale. When I pressed the final key, the upload that would trigger the server to dump its contents to the public, I felt a weight lift from my chest that I hadn't realized I was carrying. The room went silent. Elena leaned back, her weapon finally lowered to her side. "It's done," she said quietly. I left that building an hour later, stepping out into a cool, gray morning. I didn't look back. I had a new identity, a new set of documents provided by Elena's associates, and, more importantly, I had a future that was entirely my own. Mark received his enormous term behind bars, not just for his crimes, but for his desperate attempt to deflect them onto me. The case became a landmark, a story of corporate greed and betrayal that captivated the public for months. Vane and his inner circle disappeared into the judicial system, their influence stripped away by the very evidence I had pulled from the basement safe. I heard later that the entire infrastructure of their group had been dismantled, the records I provided serving as the master key that opened every locked door they had hidden behind. I moved across the country to a small, quiet town where no one knew my name and no one cared about my aesthetic. I started a small business, something simple and honest, far removed from the boardrooms and the secrets. There were days early on when I would look at a stranger in a suit and my heart would skip a beat, waiting for the familiar dread to return. But it never did. Sometimes, I think about the champagne in the fridge back at that house, the vintage bottle I had bought for Mark's promotion. I never got to drink it, but as I sat on my porch on a quiet Tuesday evening, watching the sunset, I opened a bottle of wine that I had chosen for myself, not for an occasion, but because I was alive to enjoy it. I wasn't the wife of an executive anymore. I wasn't a victim, and I wasn't a pawn. I was finally, for the first time in my adult life, the only person writing the story. The screen of my phone stayed dark, the ghosts of my past finally silenced, and for the first time, I felt the exquisite, terrifying, and wonderful peace of a future that belonged to no one but me.